Hello, everyone. We will be getting started in a few moments, so you're welcome to find a seat and we will get started shortly. Right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Marianne, and I'm the store manager here at City Bookshop, which is an independent, community-minded, and woman-owned bookstore. Is this anybody's first time here? Wonderful. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for those of you who are returning. And thank you for everyone joining us online as well. Tonight, we are excited to welcome Laura Sims for a discussion of her newest novel, How Can I Help You? What could be better than a suspenseful novel about a library worker with a sinister past and a librarian / would-be author who's drawn dangerously into her story? How Can I Help You kept me on the edge of my seat, and I'm so excited to hear from Laura tonight. If you enjoy tonight's event, you may also be interested in our August 6th event with Naomi Hirahara to discuss Evergreen, the sequel to Clark and Division, a post-World War II mystery. You can find more information about this event and other events on our website. Before we get started, some very quick housekeeping notes. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones if you have them. If you need a restroom tonight, they're located upstairs past the cash register. More importantly, if you still need a copy of either of tonight's books, you can purchase a copy at the register as well. And we'll have a Q&A and signing line following the discussion. If you are online, you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions throughout the evening. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's conversation partner, Johannes Lichtman. Johannes Lichtman's debut novel, Such Good Work, was chosen as a 5 under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation. His second novel, Calling Ukraine, was published in April. His stories and essays have appeared in Tin House, The Sun, Travel and Leisure, Los Angeles Review of Books, Oxford American, and elsewhere. He lives in Washington, D.C. And joining us to discuss her newest novel, Laura Sims is the author of the critically acclaimed novel, Looker. An award-winning poet, Sims has published 4 poetry collections. Her essays and poems have appeared in the New Republic, Boston Review, Electric Lit, and more. She and her family live in New Jersey, where she works part-time as a reference librarian and hosts the library's lecture series. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here to celebrate Laura's fantastic new book, How Can I Help You? Do you want to start off by reading a little bit?
Yes. Can you hear me? Do I need this? Yes, we need this for Zoom. We need it for Zoom. I just want to start out by saying thank you so much to the bookstore for hosting us, and thank you so much to Johannes for doing this with me. And wonderful to see family and friends here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Oh gosh. So I wanted to talk about Johannes's latest book, Calling Ukraine.
No one wants to hear about that.
They do. They do. It is such a wonderful book. I read it last year in manuscript form. And sometimes when you read a book in manuscript form, I don't know if you feel this way, but it can kind of taint the reading experience. That was not the case at all with this book. I devoured it. It was one of, I say it's one of my favorite reads of 2022 because I read it 2022, but it came out this year. And I just highly, highly recommend this book. You should get it. It's fantastic. So
thank you so
they
much.
have copies here. Great. So yeah, I will start just by telling you a little bit about the book, and then I'll read a little bit about read a little bit from it. It's about 2 local librarians, who one of whom is Margot, the other is Patricia. And Margot is a former nurse with, I have a nurse, My stepmother is a nurse, so I'm defaming her occupation with this
So
book.
there's already a lot of
But-
knowing laughter in the audience. I,
know,
think it's gonna be
know.
a fun night.
It's gonna be fun. But there are bad nurses, but not Judy. She's a wonderful nurse as far as I know. And so Margot is a former nurse with a trail of suspicious patient deaths in her past. And she has escaped and come to this small town in Illinois to work as a librarian or to be a library worker. And she has been living there peacefully for a couple of years when Patricia shows up. And Patricia is also running from a past not quite so dark, but she is a writer and she considers herself a failed novelist because she worked on this novel that she wrote for many years and couldn't publish it. And so she is trained as a reference librarian, and she has decided to come and just focus on being a librarian. And then the two women meet, and the moment that they meet, they are drawn to each other for different reasons. And that's where the trouble starts. So I won't tell you much more than that, but I will read from close to the beginning, but not quite the beginning. This is Margot. The book is told in their two alternating perspectives. And this is Margot's perspective. And this is close to Patricia has arrived, and Margot is already feeling unsettled by her presence. So, while I'm checking out a pile of comic books for two teens, I glance Patricia's way. Stylish and sleek, she's like a rare bird over there, flaunting her feathers in the gloom. She radiates coolness, too. I look around, trying to see the library through her eyes, the water stains on the ceiling, the faded gray love seat in YA, the drawn faces of our computer users washed deadly white or gray in the light of their screens. Will she stay in a place like this or just land here for a while before flitting away? I turn my full attention back to the teens. These ones aren't so bad. They're nervous and shy with acne-pitted skin and mouths full of metal. You kids have any schoolwork to do, or are these comic books your homework? I ask, and they titter. They're manga, the boy says, but not unkindly, not haughtily. I know what manga are. After 2 years, I've learned, but I play along anyway. While we're chatting, I sense Patricia's eyes on me, her interest warming my skin. What brought you here, Margot? She's wondering. But when I look up, she's picking through the desk drawers, examining a ruler, not the least bit interested in learning my story, of course. Who am I to her? My spirits sag a little as I say goodbye to the teens. Just behind them is Julia Mather, one of our top 5 local eccentrics. It's like she popped up out of nowhere with her long flyaway gray hair, her gnarled hands and glossy red nails. It's hard not to stare at those nails as she gestures wildly. She's clearly worked up. I've returned several books in that metal box outside, and you all continue to lose them. I wait for a beat. She'll go on. Julia always goes on. I returned one just the other day, and now it's listed as lost, and apparently I owe money. My taxes pay your salaries here, you know. We do know. Julia has told us many times. Other patrons have too. If the book is lost, I start, but it isn't. I returned it to the metal box, Julia insists. My fingers tap quickly across the keyboard to bring up her record. Ah, I say. With one hand, with one set of red nails, she twitches a long strand of hair over her shoulder. I stare at the screen, pretending to be lost in thought. Usually, Julia amuses me. Today, though, she simply annoys me. I try to breathe and relax my face. I had patients like her, of course, domineering ones who were always right, no matter what the nurses and doctors said or did. But patients were easier to deal with. half naked and vulnerable in their hospital gowns, shivering with illness or fear, even as they struggled for power. You knew they wanted comfort, reassurance more than anything, and it was easy to provide. I never raised my voice once, like some others did. I only smiled and soothed them with words or a quick jab. A shame I can't do that with Julia. I stare at her coldly, scanning her body. When she was younger, she must have been beautifully slim. Now she's the kind of thin that makes your skin hurt to look at her. Her nails are hidden under glossy color, but I bet they're ridged and bumpy, signs of ill health. And her dry, rasping cough doesn't bode well either, but who knows? People like her can live off bitterness for years, unless someone helps them, nudges them over the rim. What is it? What does it say? Julia leans forward, breaking the spell as she cranes her neck toward my screen. I refuse to turn it toward her, though I'm supposed to. I see one book here that is long overdue, The Rise of Towson Manor by J.S. Cullen. She nods vigorously. That's the one. Go out there and check. Go out there right now and you'll see it's there. In my mind, I'm lifting her up in the air, rattling her bones, dropping her back down. That isn't my job, Mrs. Mather. Other staff members do that regularly. If it were in the box, they would have found it by now, and we'd see it here in the system. I tap my screen. Julia rears up, lifting her hands with her voice. This is the 44th book of mine you've lost. I won't pay this library a cent. I pay your salary, you know, and everyone's salary here. She rakes her nails through the air to include us all, the layabouts who profit from Julia's bounteous wealth. Patricia is watching. Everyone is watching. I have the urge to bark out an angry laugh, but I beat it back. I'm afraid this is the 44th book of ours that you've lost, Mrs. Mather, I say quietly, leaning close and staring into her roomy blue eyes. Just as her quivering lips open to protest, I lean even closer. Now go home and find that book. Go home and find the other books too. If you don't, you'll be paying a hefty fine, one that's long overdue. I'll collect it myself. Julia takes 2 stumbling steps back. I think she'll make a fuss, but then her hands wilt at her sides. She steps farther back from the desk, staring at me. Then she turns suddenly and shuttles through the door, her curtain of gray hair flying behind her.
I'm so happy you read that passage. I mean, there's so many ones to pick from in your lovely book, but lovely is the wrong word. Thrilling, exciting, spellbinding, very dark. But you really nicely captured the tension between Margot's calmness and her tone and the crazy things she's thinking.
Yes.
And also the way that she achieves a sort of status at this library, even though she doesn't like books, because she can deal with everyone.
Yes.
With a very outward calm,
Yes.
which, as you know, people who love books, we tend to be easily flustered, and she is not.
That's true.
But we'll get more to Margot later. But I wanted to start off like, you know, it's a story of 2 women starting over. It's a thriller about murder and different kinds of stealing life. But it's really a book about libraries. And I wonder if we could just start by, if you could talk a little bit about how libraries have affected your writing and how they've affected your life.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like many writers, I grew up going to the local library and reading. My dad used to take me there on Saturdays because he didn't quite know what to do with me. This is a divorced dad. And he would like go browse for hours in the adult section and leave me in the children's section with Mrs. Gloria Nottingham, the librarian, whose name I remember. And I read, and I think I was already a reader and already a writer too at that point, but it definitely, you know, drove it home, was spending all that time in the library. So I loved it there, and felt safe and all of those wonderful feelings we associate with libraries. So early influence, like many writers. And then now I work in a library, obviously, or maybe, yes, she read that in my bio. I work part-time in a library. And so I started working more frequently at my library where I work now during the pandemic. And for me, it was a lot of people didn't want to return to work at the time, understandably, but I wanted to get out of my house and get back to some kind of like semblance of society. And we were one of the only places open at the time. It was us and the groceries and the liquor stores. And sometimes a bad combo for us. So I really got to sink into the library during that time. And really, at libraries, you see the whole array of human existence and behavior. And so it's a wonderful place for a writer. It's kind of like a subway car, or, it's like you see everything. And so I really enjoyed it. And I started to think I need to write about the library. I also really wanted to show the public library as it is today. I think we're surrounded with depictions of libraries that are very romanticized and outdated. Libraries as these sacred and silent book vaults with the librarian in her reading glasses and cardigan, shushing people. But I wanted to show what it's like now, which, yes, it's a sanctuary, and I think of it as a sacred place. It's one of the few public institutions that people still trust, not everybody. But it is a sacred place, but it is also one of the last public places that welcomes everyone in our society, and particularly people who have been left behind by other institutions that should be taking care of them. They come to the library. And so people think when they hear that I'm a reference librarian that I spend my time in these deep research projects with people. That is rarely, maybe in the past 4 years that's happened twice, I'm not sure, but most of the time I spend helping people with the computer. A lot of people who are left behind by the digital revolution, they don't have computers at home. That's the kind of work that we're doing, helping people scan documents, apply for public housing, counseling them about health and mental health, like a lot of things that librarians are not trained to do, but there's nobody else to do them. So I wanted to capture that. And I just started like taking notes at a certain point about my encounters with people, which are fascinating and weird and inspiring and funny and heartwarming and everything. But I didn't know what I was going to write. I just was like taking notes in a notebook, sort of like Patricia does, the writer in my book. What? Oh, exactly. Yes. So, yeah. So that it was a very roundabout way of saying that is how the library.
Well, yeah, and I think you bring up some really interesting points because at least in our country, the library is one of the only places that's free.
Yes.
Where you can just be,
yes,
and you don't have to buy anything.
Yeah.
It's maybe a park and a library.
Yeah. And the park is dependent on weather.
Right. And libraries are very hard to get kicked out of.
They really are.
You gotta do a lot. Which
Johannes has tried.
Yeah, exactly. They always let me stay. And that's a great recipe for tension, because you mentioned the subway car, and there is a similarity there because you never know who's going to step onto a subway car, right? And you can't ask them to leave, right? But you're probably going to be leaving in the next 10 to 20 to 30 minutes from the subway car. Library, especially if you work there, you're there.
Yeah.
And it seems like, what opportunities did that setting give you for I mean, Patricia, but I'm thinking especially Margot,
Yeah.
because she describes, you mentioned the library as a sanctuary. Margot describes it as a sanctuary too,
Yeah.
but she doesn't read.
Right. Yes, she doesn't read. She does. She loves the library. She sees it, yeah, as the safe, welcoming place for her to be a good girl after being very bad for many years. And it has helped her quell her urges until Patricia pops up. But yes, it's interesting that I loved making her not a reader. That was very fun. And then she's interesting because she's insecure about the fact that she doesn't read. She works in a library and she's surrounded by colleagues who are readers, and but she makes this distinction about readers aren't doers, right? I'm a doer, I'm a helper, and I don't need to read. She had been too busy as a nurse to read, and now she doesn't read. And so one of the main tensions I feel like between her and Patricia is that Patricia is a reader and a writer, and she has a really conflicted relationship with doing and helping. Like, she is drawn to public service to a certain point, but because she's really a writer, and I can't relate to this at all, but because she's really a writer, her writerly ambitions conflict with her, desire,
Right.
interest in helping.
And she isn't thrilled when she gets her job as the reference
No.
librarian, and she finds out what you just mentioned,
Right.
that there's very little reference involved. It's more
Yes.
people calling and asking, how do I get on the internet? What time is Wheel of Fortune on tonight?
Yes, yes. When is the next old car show in the next town over? So many, yes, interesting calls. But unlike Patricia, I love every single one of those weird encounters. Yeah. So I love working there.
That's great.
It is.
The Q&A portion will be later. No, just kidding. Can you talk a little bit about, so you mentioned you have the two protagonists, and it's told in a dueling first person, which is not unique, but it's a pretty unusual point of view to have the two first person narrators sort of alternating chapters, and the tension is rising and rising. And Margot and Patricia are both sort of trying to start over. Patricia is trying to start over as someone who's not a writer anymore, and Margot is trying to start over someone who doesn't kill people anymore. And they both kind of relapse. But can you talk a little bit about writing those two narrators and using two narrators?
Yes. I started with Margot's voice. I had known for a long time that I wanted to write a novel about a female serial killer. I really am really fascinated by serial killers, but especially women serial killers, because they're very rare. And because they often kill inside of caretaking roles, right? Which are places where women have been assigned to be for millennia, caretakers. And so I find, and I'm not saying that women serial killers think of themselves as feminist, but I'm saying that my reading of their behavior inside of, taking care, being nurses, nursing parents, taking care of children, which is how most women kill when they do kill, is a kind of defiant act. At least that's my reading of it. So anyway, always wanted to do that. So I started with her voice, and I knew I had those notes from the library. And at a certain point, and I don't remember how or why, I realized, she has to be at the library and she's done killing. Like, I'm not writing that novel. So I had that, but it felt like too much of a closed system, which was my first book, Looker. It was a very closed system, one perspective, but I felt this time that I wanted more and like liveliness, maybe because it was during the pandemic and I wanted some more company. I don't know, but I wanted, so I felt like she needed a foil. And so Patricia becomes the foil. I put a lot of myself in Patricia. as a writer, we're very familiar. I mean, speaking for myself, I'm sure Johannes has no experience with failure, frustration, or
I've been wildly successful from the beginning.
So, so I, could pour those feelings into Patricia, into making her. And it was really fun to alternate between the two. And I enjoyed telling, and I know some readers will not like this, but I do tell the same scene sometimes from different perspectives. And really, I loved Margot from the beginning, and I loved writing her. She's like, very voicey and fun to be in her head. But as the novel progressed, I started to like Patricia more.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
She kind of evolves
Right.
in ways that we can't talk
So
about.
eventually you liked the writer more than the murderer.
Yeah.
Solid.
But I'm trying to write this essay right now that I should have turned in a week ago about how writers are like serial killers. And so I have always wanted to pair a writer and a serial killer in a work. But no, if you think about it, both driven by obsession. I mean, these are two women driven by their urges, their obsessions, their passions. Compartmentalizing. We both compartmentalize, right? You have to compartmentalize so you can like present normally to the world as your like weird writer brain is clicking along. And anyway, there are others, but
well, so since you brought it up, there is a question at the heart of this book about the ethics of writing about another person, and the comparison you made overtly just now between killing and taking someone's story and making it your book or essay or whatever, is something that the characters in the book are dealing with. I believe Patricia, so she starts writing about Margot. I don't want to give away too much of the plot.
Yeah.
She becomes very interested in her fellow librarian Margot and starts covertly writing about her. And at times she starts to feel a little bit guilty about it. But I believe she says to herself at one point, I'm just writing fiction. It's not like I've committed a crime. But it doesn't seem like she fully believes that. And it doesn't seem like you fully believe it either. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ethics of writing about another person.
Yeah, it is fraught. I do. I mean, even just writing my library anecdotes, obviously they're highly fictionalized, but I definitely, I mean, it's what writers do. We won't have a lot to say if we don't steal from other people's lives and pains and joys. But there's definitely a pang of guilt. And in some ways, the book is a bit of a self-interrogation for me about why I'm drawn to this, and is it okay that I'm writing about this? So Patricia is kind of my stand-in for that. And, Margot is kind of she's clearly unethical, right, but doesn't know it. She is trapped in her perspective and wholly convinced in her perspective and the way she lives. But Patricia is in a grayer area. So she's definitely aware when she's doing this that maybe she's doing something that's not right. And, you have to read to find out if she continues doing it or pauses and steps back.
So since you mentioned writing and murdering, there's a great book about this called The Journalist and the Murderer by Janet Malcolm, which is a fantastic book from 1990. It's a nonfiction. I'm sure some of you read it, but for those who haven't, it's a nonfiction book which interrogates the ethics of journalism. And the writer writes about a murderer and a journalist who spends a lot of time with the murderer during his trial and kind of pretends to be the murderer's friend. And then after the murderer is convicted, he writes a pretty damning book about him. And then the murderer sues him for defamation. And the jury likes the murderer who killed his family better than the writer who stole his life, because they are so disgusted of that he could do this to steal. And I wonder, I don't think that there's any real ethical question of like who's doing the worst thing,
Right.
Margot or Patricia. But given that it's something that you've obviously thought a lot about in your own life, like what are the questions you have to ask yourself when you decide if someone else's life is okay to write about?
Oh gosh. I mean, one of the things that makes me feel okay-ish about, so Margot, I don't think I said yet, is drawn from a historical figure named Jane Toppin, who was called Jolly Jane. And she lived in the 1800s. She was this cheerful, efficient, wonderful nurse who was injecting her patients with morphine and atropine and climbing on top of them to watch them die in a state of ecstasy. She was in a state of ecstasy. They were not. And so she totally fascinates me for so many reasons. But I think one of the reasons I feel a little bit okay about writing about her or loosely basing my character on her is that it took place, 200 years ago.
Right.
I mean, so that kind of helps. And
just to be clear, I'm
Yeah.
asking from a position of curiosity because I do
Right.
the same thing.
Yes,
and people
he
get
does.
mad at me sometimes.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how do you do it so they don't get mad at you?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't really know, but yeah.
So what was it you mentioned that this is a historical figure? And
Yeah.
what
I mean, she's based on this woman, Jane. Margot is based on this woman, Jane Toppin, and Jolly Jane, and also Charles Cullen, who you may have heard of more recently. He was one of the best true crime books ever written, The Good Nurse. It's terrifying, utterly terrifying. But she's based on him because when the hospitals knew what he was doing, he probably killed 400 people in the hospitals in New Jersey, my home state. He's from there, and he started there and worked his way around the East Coast, and the hospitals were aware of what was happening, and kind of like the priests, they moved him from hospital to hospital, sometimes with a recommendation letter, because if they had acknowledged what he was doing, they would have been sued to death. So that happens to Margot for a while. It's like people are kind of low-key aware that things are not right, but they know, and they move her around. And I forget how that connects, but
yeah, and as you brought up, you are operating a little bit, not fully, but a little bit in this genre of, I guess it's not true crime, but serial killer books and podcasts and shows are so popular right now.
I know.
And you're approaching it from a different angle.
Yeah.
But how do you navigate like the questions and sort of, morality issues that anyone who makes like a serial killer drama navigates?
Yeah. It's tricky. I mean, to me, I find serial killers really fascinating because I find humans fascinating. And I find that the most extreme examples of humanity can teach us a lot about who we are as regular people, so-called regular people. And I love characters who, I mean, Margot is pretty extreme, but I like making readers uncomfortable in feeling that not that they could quite go to that extreme maybe, but that maybe they could relate to someone and kind of understand being in this ambiguous place where possibly you step across a line and you engage in unethical, antisocial, even murderous behavior. I mean, as we know, given the right context, given the right set of circumstances, humans are capable of pretty much anything, good or bad. I do think humans are great, but there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. So I like exploring that. So I'm hoping that comes across rather than like a salient, I don't know, indulging in like the gore of a serial
No,
killer
I
or
think,
something.
I
you
mean,
know?
I think it definitely does come across, and there's a great humanity to the book, even in the darkness. And that's the two perspectives really help.
Yeah.
And also the way you explore Margot's perspective and how that changes throughout the book.
Yeah.
But you've had an unusual journey as a writer in that you were successful as a poet and you published writing about David Markson, and then you started writing novels.
Yeah.
This is being your second. How do you think that your journey as a poet and, as an expert on the fantastic experimental novelist David Markson?
Glad you're a fan.
Oh, I love David Markson. But how has that influenced your writing of, well, Looker too, but of this book?
Yeah, I mean, I still feel like a poet on the inside, but I just don't write it anymore. I haven't, and since writing Looker,
Oh, really? Do you made the switch cold turkey?
I guess so. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like I still take the same creative energy. I'm just putting it into a different form. Poetry still informs my sense of the line. I care a lot about the sound of my, I don't write. I think when people think of a poet's novel, they sometimes think it should be this flowery, and I don't write like that, but I do care about the sound of my lines a lot. I'm very visual as a fiction writer, and I like efficiency of language.
Well, yeah, you have a real
it.
brevity and concision to your expression, like David Markson.
Like David Markson. So yes, David Markson is a wonderful fiction writer who is gone now, but I first encountered his work when I read Wittgenstein's Mistress, and it changed my life. I know it's so dramatic to say that about a book, but it really just blew me away. It's a novel told in fragments, and I wrote him this fan letter, and we started this correspondence, and we became friends until his death in 2010. And his work taught me that I, as a poet, could write a novel like that, maybe like not a tradition, like that novels could look a lot of different ways, and that I could handle a novel in kind of fragments or, in pieces that seemed manageable to me. So yeah, it's definitely, still influences me to this day.
And you see that a lot in Looker, the sort of the way you use fragments to create a very coherent and vibrant whole.
Yeah.
But also in this book.
Yeah.
But David Markson, my favorite story about him is that the reviewer of Wittgenstein's Mistress wrote, "This is not a novel,"
in the review.
And then for his next book, he called it "This is not a novel," which I think is great. But
great.
I'll do one more question before we open it up to Q&A. But this book, it's earned a lot of comparisons to Patricia Highsmith, which is great.
Which is nice.
So I wanted to ask you about, do you see Highsmith as an influence, and who were your influences in general when you were writing this book in particular?
That's a great question. I love Patricia Highsmith. I almost said Patricia. I love Patricia Highsmith. I've read a lot of her books. I would say one of the first influences for this book that I can track back to is this novel called See What I Have Done by Sarah Schmidt. She's an Australian writer. And I read it maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, but it is a novel. She says that the ghost of Lizzie Borden visited her, and she felt compelled to write this novel about Lizzie Borden. And that book is so beautiful and lyrically written and serious and layered. And so reading that, I was like, because, when you write about crime, and there's a tendency to have a dismissive reaction sometimes, right? Like it's not serious fiction if you have a killer in it or something. But that book was one that I read and thought like, oh, this is a way to write, about the dark, creepy things I want to write about in a serious way, after I finished the draft, a friend of mine who read it early said, "Have you read Patricia Highsmith's The Blunderer?" and I hadn't. It's like had never heard of it. It's a less well-known one of hers. And so I went out and got it, and it's so good. And it's creepy how much there is some echoing going on, but it's about these two men, one of whom makes his wife's death look like an accident. And there's an article in the paper about it. And this other man who wants to kill his wife and make it look like an accident sees this and is inspired by it. And they start this little dance, right? They meet each other. It's very weird and has this great resolution. So I can't say it influenced it, but it was kind of like a companion reading that. And then a huge influence was, or another companion book was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, which pops up in the book. And it was just a book that I reread while I was writing this because I was having a hard time reading things that I picked up I couldn't get into, and I reread that one, and I love that book so much. And so I used it in the book as the one book that Margot reads and loves.
And I was going to ask you about that, but
yeah, we're
I
out
think
of time.
we got to turn it over to the crowd now. So does anyone have any questions for Laura?
Or for Johannes?
No. Yes.
Oh,
So I think the question is just to repeat for the viewers at home. What other books Margot was reading?
or what she might like.
What she might like.
Nothing. It's that book or nothing. Yeah.
And what, just to follow up on that, why does she like We Have Always Lived in the Castle?
Well,
I mean, there's some in the book, but you have a strong connection to the book.
Yeah, she it's a point, I use it as a point of like connection between her and Patricia. She sees Patricia admiring it and picks it up herself, looks at the cover, and it's the cover that I have that's like this vintage cover, and likes it. And then she reads the back, and it is about, a murderer, and she kind of is like, oh, I'm going to take it home and look at the cover. And then she starts reading it, and she has like this ideal. I feel like that book, it's just so good. It's just like pure storytelling and so weird and wonderful. And so I loved recreating that experience in Margot. She has this like ideal reading experience of that book. Yeah.
Great. Other questions? Yeah, over here.
Yes, Courtney.
In both novels, you seem very drawn to the interior lives of women.
Yeah.
Particularly those parts of the interior lives that do not match up to sort of societal expectations.
Yeah.
Easy compartmentalization. What society sort of deems as the appropriate boundaries of the female self. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, you've said it already, Courtney. That's what I love to write. That is exactly what I love to write. I love writing, showing the darkness behind, the facade sometimes. I love playing with that, and especially in women and female characters. Yes. Yeah.
Do you think that because it's risky, right?
Yeah.
Certain readers may not have the bandwidth for understanding it, or challenge them overly. And I'm curious. I love the fact that you certainly you came out hitting the second time around this spell. And is that something you think that will continue?
Oh, right. Oh, gosh.
I was going to repeat it, but he was
yeah.
like eloquent and multi-part. I was like, I'm just going to let it fly. The first part was right. Well, the short version was writing the interiority of women, and the
Right.
second part was the risks inherent in that.
Right.
And then there was a lot more, but you have to come in person if you want to hear the full question.
That's right. Oh my gosh. And now I've forgotten like what the actual question was, Courtney. Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, I see. Yes. Yes. I finished a really, really bad draft, right, of the next thing. So it sort of continues, but with a difference. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. That's so vague. Yeah. That is my stepdad.
For the viewers at home, Laura's stepdad just said he is glad she no longer lives with him. Sorry, please continue.
Yes. Yay.
Why a small town versus like a small neighborhood library or suburbs? People can kind of look suburbs easily.
That's a good point.
So the question was, why is the story set in a small town versus
Yeah.
a different size town?
Thank you, Johannes. I don't know. Maybe, I mean, I live in a small town now, so it's kind of about what's around me, but it's a very good point. Easy to disappear in a small library in a big city. But I don't know, maybe it's kind of a romanticized notion too of like disappearing. You disappear to some obscure town somewhere instead of a bustling city.
I think do we have time for one more? Or I think we have time for one more if there's another question.
We do have a question from the virtual audience.
Okay.
What is your favorite library you've ever been?
Oh gosh. I mean, I guess it's my childhood library that I was talking about at the beginning. It's still like very present in my mind. I can see it very clearly, but I do love the library where I work now and have very, very fond feelings about it. I love my coworkers, patrons. Yeah, it's been a happy place.
Sorry.
Friday Guy. Love Friday Guy.
Where was your childhood library?
Richmond, Virginia. Yeah, that's where I grew up.
Can I answer this one too?
Yes, please.
Because my favorite library is from my hometown in Stockholm.
Oh, I bet they have amazing
They've got really beautiful
libraries.
It's a big silo. It's designed by Gunnar Asplund, and they have a good coffee shop in there. Also, there's
Did you say copy or coffee?
Coffee.
Oh,
we don't need copies of anything. We just need coffee. There's also a sign in 10 languages that says like, all the directions. And then only the sign in Swedish says, don't move the furniture. Because apparently only Swedish patrons need to be told to stop moving
furniture.
the furniture. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I wish we could tell our patrons that. Wow.
But I think, are we at time? Or I think we're great.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you so much, everyone.
For coming.
I want to say thank you so much again to Laura Sims and Johannes Lichtman for joining us tonight. And thank you to all of you for being here as well. If you would like to purchase a copy of tonight's books, both highly recommended. You can find them right upstairs at the cash register or online. We do ship. And if you're staying behind, we'll be setting up a signing line here in just a moment. You can help us out by just pulling up your chairs and putting them to the side of the room. We'll take a moment to flip the space, and then we can start the line right over near where that speaker is. And let's get one more round of applause for our wonderful authors tonight. Thank you so much.